Hello class, welcome to Module 6, Video 2 of Music Appreciation Online, the Romantic Era. Our next composer is Felix Mendelssohn, who was also a child prodigy of the piano, and while he was a brilliant pianist, he is most known for his composing. Born into a wealthy German family, Mendelssohn and his sister Fanny were afforded the opportunity to travel throughout Europe studying with some of the finest musicians at the time. Felix began composing at an early age and as a teenager wrote works that were quite mature. Mendelssohn composed in all the genres common at the time, but he wrote no opera. Again, this is unusual since opera was quite popular throughout the 19th century. Can you think of any other German composers who did not write opera? We discussed one in an earlier module. In 1835, Mendelssohn took a job in Leipzig, Germany, conducting the Gewandhaus Orchestra. The name Gewandhaus means clothier's house and was basically an old textile mill where the orchestra rehearsed. Mendelssohn turned it into one of the finest professional orchestras in Europe. The Gewandhaus Orchestra of Leipzig is still one of the top orchestras in Europe today. Mendelssohn is credited with rejuvenating the music of earlier composers such as Bach, Handel, and Mozart. As a composer, Mendelssohn was somewhat conservative but still maintained a very personal style. For a musical example of Mendelssohn's work, we will hear the Concerto for Violin in E minor. Mendelssohn wrote this piece for his friend, the violin virtuoso Ferdinand David. It is a very expressive work in 3 movements, but Mendelssohn does put his personal stamp on the concerto format. First, the 3 movements are connected musically. There is no pause between the movements, in other words. In the first movement that you will hear, Mendelssohn veers away from the traditional classical mold by omitting the double exposition. Theme 1 begins after 2 short measures. Also, there are tempo changes that add to the emotional content of the piece. The cadenza, which had been a minor part of the classical style concertos, becomes an integral part of this work. Mendelssohn composed a challenging cadenza that comes at the end of the development section and helps to introduce the recapitulation of this first movement. The key element of this piece is passion. Listen at the connect site. The violin soloist is Hilary Hahn, the American virtuoso. She recorded this piece when she was only in her early 20s. It was a wonderful performance and shows the skill of a true virtuoso. There is also a YouTube video of Miss Hahn performing this work. One of the major developments of 19th century music was the prevalence of program music. Most composers during the Romantic period composed works based on literary concepts. Many of these were for solo piano or chamber music groups, but there were 4 main types of program music composed for the symphony orchestra. As a reminder, program music is instrumental music based on a story, poem, idea, or scene. It could be based on a legend or natural wonder. The program is not only the printed brochure one gets when entering a concert or recital, it is also the explanatory notes about the music. Music that does not feature a program is called absolute music. We have already mentioned the symphonic poem, also called tone poem, a single movement work that might appear in a variety of forms, sonata allegro, 3-part, or some other form. The program symphony is a work in several movements, like the typical symphony, but each movement tells a different part of the story. The concert overture is a stand-alone work not intended to introduce a staged work of any kind, so it is not like the opera overture. Concert overtures are single movement pieces that nearly always follow the sonata allegro format. Finally, incidental music is intended to enhance a play, usually as background music or instrumental interludes. Felix Mendelssohn, whose violin concerto we just discussed, wrote some well-known incidental music for A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. Hector Berlioz was one of the first French Romantic composers. His innovations in tone color set him apart from many other composers of the first half of the 19th century. Berlioz was not from a musical family, and he had originally intended to be a doctor, but once he had to carve into cadavers, he decided music was a better pursuit. Berlioz was a quick study and learned a great deal by studying scores of other composers, especially operas. Berlioz is credited with adding instruments to the orchestra, such as the English horn, bass clarinet, contrabassoon, cornet, and tuba. He wrote a book on orchestration called Treatise on Instrumentation and Modern Orchestration. Orchestration is the art of assigning tone color. Berlioz was ahead of his time and was not respected by the Paris establishment. He often had to arrange his own concerts, and the cost was prohibitive. To supplement his income, he became a music critic and was renowned for his wit and insight. Berlioz composed mostly for orchestra or orchestra and chorus, although he did write several operas. Berlioz's most famous work is his Symphonie Fantastique. You don't have to speak French to know this means fantastic symphony. The title is meant to imply the fantasy world of the story that Berlioz concocted for this piece. This is a great example of a programmed symphony. The program Berlioz wrote was intended as an expression of his love for the English actress Harriet Smithson, who traveled to Paris to perform works of Shakespeare as a part of an English acting troupe. Berlioz saw Harriet as Juliet in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and in true romantic fashion, he fell in love with her. Berlioz used a recurring theme that he described as idée fixe, or fixed idea. This melody was to represent Harriet Smithson each time we hear it. Berlioz transformed this theme to fit other parts of the story. You can read more about the budding romance and read the program for this piece in your text or on the Connect website. As mentioned earlier, Nationalism was a cultural movement that featured elements intended to give a musical picture of the composer's homeland. This sentiment was popular all over Europe and even in the United States. It was especially popular in Scandinavia, Bohemia, and Russia. We will look at the music of Bohemian composer Bedřich Smetana. You should be familiar with the Russian Five. I don't expect you to remember the names of all of these guys, but you should know that this group of 5 young Russian composers set out to create a Russian nationalist sound. The best known of the 5 are Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and Modest Mussorgsky. The music of these 2 greats has appeared in countless movies, such as Disney's Fantasia. Bohemia in the 19th century was a lively center of cultural activity, especially in the capital of Prague. Several composers led by Bedřich Smetana created a national style based largely on folk music of the region. Smetana was known for his operas, but wrote a famous set or cycle of tone poems meant to describe various aspects of Bohemian life and culture. The cycle is known as Ma Vlast, or My Country in English. This is a set of 6 tone poems, and perhaps the most famous is the Moldau, which describes the largest river in Bohemia, which eventually became known as Czechoslovakia but is now called the Czech Republic. You can read more about this work and hear it at the Connect website. This is on your list of works to know for test number 5. Perhaps the most famous Russian composer of all is Peter Tchaikovsky. He was another composer who started into music at a late age. After a career as a judicial clerk, in his early 20s, Tchaikovsky attended the Music Conservatory in St. Petersburg, Russia, his hometown. He was a quick study and was able to land a job as a professor at the Conservatory of Moscow. Tchaikovsky was influenced by Russian music but was not a nationalist composer, though he counted the Russian Five among his many friends. He composed in all the genres of the time, but may be best known for his ballets and symphonies. For about 14 years, Tchaikovsky received an annuity from Nadezhda von Meck, a wealthy Russian patroness who was fond of Tchaikovsky's music. One of Tchaikovsky's best-known works is a concert overture, the Romeo and Juliet Overture Fantasy. It is based on the play by Shakespeare, but does not attempt to portray the whole play musically. Instead, Tchaikovsky provides imagery of the play, especially the conflict between the feuding families, the Montagues and the Capulets. There are themes associated with the various aspects of the play, such as the slow opening introduction featuring Friar Lawrence's theme. This is in the expected sonata allegro form, and when the tempo becomes fast, we can hear the battle. The second theme is perhaps the most memorable part of the piece, and may be the most heard love theme of all time. It has appeared in countless TV shows and movies, and is especially popular with advertisers. I am certain you will recognize it. At the end, this theme is transformed into somewhat of a funeral dirge as the story comes to its tragic close. Listen to this great piece on the Connect site. It is on the playlist for your next test. Our next composer is Johannes Brahms, the German master mentioned earlier. Brahms was another gifted pianist who was from a musical family. He studied piano and composition in his hometown, Hamburg, Germany. He met Robert and Clara Schumann while he was touring as a pianist in his early 20s. The Schumanns were impressed with Brahms and his music, and Robert promoted the young composer in his magazine. Brahms was a bit more conservative than some, but infused his music with rhythmic excitement, contrapuntal texture, and passionate melodies. He composed in all the genres of the time except he wrote no opera. Sound familiar? This is the third German composer that composed no opera. Can you think of the other two? Our example is from the Symphony No. 3 in F major. Brahms was viewed as the logical successor to Beethoven as a composer of symphonies, and he proved to be up to the task. He only composed 4 symphonies, but they were all masterpieces. The third symphony features a beautiful third movement. It doesn't follow the traditional minuet or scherzo format, but it does have a dance-like quality and is written in triple meter. The melody of this movement was used by rock guitarist Carlos Santana for an album called Supernatural. The tune is called Love of My Life and features a vocal by Dave Matthews. Apparently Santana heard the Brahms piece on public radio as he was driving to the studio and thought it was worthy of an updated treatment. Opera in the 19th century was still a major form of entertainment. More opera houses opened and more composers wrote operas. In the early part of the 19th century, opera focused on the voice. Italian composers especially wrote what became known as bel canto style. Bel canto means beauty of singing. Composers like Gioacchino Rossini established the practice of supporting the voice with the orchestra and writing pieces that displayed the beauty of the voice. During the mid to late 19th century, 2 Italian composers in particular carried on this tradition, though their operas were not true bel canto style. Giuseppe Verdi and Giacomo Puccini wrote operas that focused on the voice. Verdi was very popular and had a gift for writing memorable melodies. He wrote 28 operas, including popular titles like Aida, Rigoletto, and La Traviata. Verdi intended his music to appeal to the common person and wrote in a very clear Italian nationalist style. He wrote works based on stories with real people as main characters, but they were usually severely flawed. Only 2 of his operas were comedies. The rest all had unhappy endings. With Rigoletto, Verdi dared to make a leading character out of a hunchback court jester. Rigoletto works for the Duke of Mantua, who is quite like Don Giovanni discussed earlier. Rigoletto's only redeeming quality is his overprotective love of his daughter, Gilda. After the Duke seduces Gilda during Act 2, Rigoletto is furious when his daughter admits falling for the Duke. In Act 3, Rigoletto's need for vengeance against the Duke ultimately leads to the death of his daughter Gilda. Read more about this opera and listen to the famous La Donna Immobile from Act 3 of Rigoletto at the Connect site. Following in the footsteps of Verdi is Giacomo Puccini, who came from a musical family. He composed some of the best-loved operas of all time, including La Bohème, Tosca, and Madame of Butterfly. Puccini studied at Milan University and lived in near poverty. After the success of his first opera, Puccini was on his way to a lucrative and critically acclaimed career. Puccini followed Verdi's example of the bel canto tradition and had a gift for writing melody. Many of his operas were in the verismo style, meaning they were true to life. His operas featured everyday people as characters, dealing with the typical challenges of life. His opera La Bohème is the story of 4 men who share a small apartment in the Latin Quarter of Paris. The main character is Rudolfo, a poet, who falls in love with his neighbor, Mimi, who is a seamstress. Act 1 has some humorous moments, including a scene where the landlord comes to the apartment demanding back rent. As a matter of fact, the Broadway musical Rent is actually based on this opera. The short version of the story is that Rudolfo and Mimi fall in love. We learn early on that Mimi has tuberculosis, which was rampant in Europe at the time. Rudolfo, being a poverty-stricken poet, knows he won't be able to take care of Mimi, so he pulls away. By the time they are reunited at the end of the opera, Mimi literally dies in Rudolfo's arms before the curtain comes down. Listen to the aria C'è gelida manina from La Bohème by Puccini. We wrap up the 19th century with one of the most popular yet controversial of all composers, the German master Richard Wagner. Wagner was from a family of writers and had intended to become a playwright. At the age of 15, he heard some of Beethoven's music and his life was changed. He committed himself to becoming a composer. He was mostly self-taught and learned by studying musical scores of other composers. Wagner never mastered an instrument. Wagner's musical philosophy was unusual and controversial. He felt that all forms of artistic expression could and should be combined to create what he called Gesamtkunstwerk, or universal artwork. His works combined singing, dancing, acting, painting, and costume design into one production. He called his operas music dramas to distinguish himself from the Italian opera composers. Wagner also wrote his own librettos, which was unusual, though he had wanted to be a playwright. Most of his operas were based on German or Scandinavian mythology, and his characters were larger-than-life heroes. Wagner focused on the orchestra in direct contrast to what the Italians had done. He used thematic transformation to create a continual musical flow that he called never-ending melody. His operas did not divide into recitatives and arias. He used a large orchestra and expected singers to project over the wall of sound he created. Wagner also used short melodies he called leitmotifs, or leading motives, to represent a person, place, or object in his dramas. Have you ever seen a Star Wars movie? Every time Darth Vader shows up, we know it, because John Williams used a leitmotif to represent him. Wagner's use of chromatic harmony was so prevalent that it helped to inspire the composers of the early 20th century who began to experiment with atonality, or absence of tonality. Our example comes from Die Walküre, one of the 4 operas Wagner composed for his famous Ring of the Nibelung. Each opera tells a different part of the story. The Ring is kind of like a combination of The Lord of the Rings and The Sword and the Stone. Some scholars speculate that Wagner was trying to make a social commentary about how society tends to destroy itself because of a lust for wealth and power. Some things never change, I suppose. The Valkyries of this story are the maiden daughters of Wotan, the god who had the gold ring and lost it, but eventually gets it back. These Valkyries ride around on horseback collecting the dead soldiers who have been fighting for Wotan's cause. The music for this scene is the famous Ride of the Valkyries, most of you would recognize. Read more about this opera on the Connect site. The plot for Die Walküre is somewhat convoluted and too much to explain here. Listen to the example from Act 1, the love scene conclusion. It has some incredibly passionate melodies. You will hear how Wagner uses the orchestra to create excitement and passion.